Let's take a look at this last question, which is how do I get good enough to use my illustration in a high-level professional setting? This could obviously mean different things to different people. What it means to me is just that I was able to sort of work towards getting the sort of jobs that, again, I wanted, right, that I aspired to do. And again, this is something I struggled with a lot, as I mentioned in previous videos. So what I want to do in this video is just talk a little bit about that issue. Obviously, it's another one of these things where, there's no sort of magic bullet or secret potion that you can take to immediately become, employable by, the highest level of art directors or anything like that. And really, most of my educational stuff is focused on how do we get good at drawing so that sort of stuff takes care of itself. But I think there's a few things here where we can unpack it, and I can share with you how I've sort of grown to think about these different sort of elements. And again, I can give you a few tips so that hopefully your journey towards this doesn't take as long as mine did. Let's get started. All right, so as I said, again, this is something I sort of struggled with quite a bit. And it's also important to, get out of the way. Again, most of my educational stuff is I really view it as trying to help people get good at drawing. Because I think if we get good at drawing and creating stuff from our imagination, then a lot of the other stuff takes care of itself. That's certainly been my experience. But that's not entirely true, right? Because I think when we are working with other people, we need to be able to include them in the process. And we also need to be able to, perform under pressure and perform to a brief, which can be different to kind of just us working, by ourselves and coming up with cool images by ourselves. It's also important to state that I don't think there is any sort of right or wrong level of, work that you kind of aspire to. I think, again, this is just answering what I feel like is a fairly sort of simple question that I get asked a lot. And it's also important to state that, a lot of my most enjoyable experiences working professionally have been working with smaller teams, independent teams, where, again, I've often felt that I'm able to have more creative freedom, more creative expression. I'm able to sort of communicate with the team and the people I'm working with a little bit more, effectively and easily, right? It's not always that, bigger is better, okay? Better is better, right? And you have to figure out what's better for you and what your aspirations are. A lot of people really want those kind of, high-end sort of jobs because, again, that's just kind of what they want. And if that's you, then I feel like that's a worthwhile pursuit. And I would also say I've had, great experiences working on my own sort of projects where, again, with friends and with coworkers, but, in a very small team, basically working towards, creating everything on a project where, I wouldn't consider it to be high level, right? In many of these cases, there's sort of time constraints and I'm kind of, I'm art directing. So I'm actually allowing myself to try and focus again on those core elements that I feel like are really going to affect the player experience. I felt like even though maybe, the work isn't of the highest sort of detail level, I've actually felt like it's some of my better work. And I felt like I've been able to make it really do the job that it needs to do. And at the end of it, I've been very sort of proud of it and happy with the product, right? So again, it's not. I'm not necessarily sort of saying that it's all or nothing, right? It's high level professional work or nothing, and that everyone should aspire to that. I think the key thing is that we're drawing and we're getting the level of drawing that we want. So again, I just feel like I need to sort of say that, right? Because it's everyone's going to be coming at that from sort of different sort of angles, and this is honestly my experience, right? Some of my best experiences have been working on, very sort of AAA games, and again a lot of sort of projects where it's like just me, right? I'm the one art directing, right? And I think, again, that's been fun for me, right? So I feel like the real key here, and again, just sort of looking at some of my sort of old work so I can kind of explain some of these concepts, but, this stuff doesn't necessarily, there's not necessarily a great visual to go with this, but I feel like the one thing that I really want to talk to is the idea that kind of it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I want to unpack that idea a little bit, because even though it doesn't directly have to do with my main concern, which is how do we get better at drawing, I think it contextualizes this issue well. So the old adage is, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I would say it's more importantly, it's who the person who's employing you knows, right? It's what do they think of you, and how do you sort of compare to the other people they're going to sort of potentially hire. And I think it is important to understand that you do need to actually build a relationship with the people you're working with, and that that relationship actually forms a large part of how you will enjoy that process, and whether or not you or they will probably want to do it again, right? It's actually really important once you handle the artistic side of it. And that's actually what they're interested in more, right? Because often people who are hiring from a very high level sort of, place, right? That they're working on projects that have a big budget, and that they need a very high level of quality. Often they also have a choice, right? They can hire pretty much anyone they want because they have the budget for it. So in many ways, those personal relationships are very important. And in many cases, they're not going to spend the majority of their time hiring new people. They're going to probably spend a small portion of their time looking for new talent and hiring new talent, and the majority of their time working with talent that they already have existing relationships with, because that makes their life easier, and because they have to produce a product, on time, on quality, right, on budget, right? That's kind of their world, that's their job. So it's important to understand that, and to understand that, yes, like that's true. It's not who you know, it's sort of what you know, and what we have to do is, again, get better at that. So there's a couple of things here. My general thesis on this is that I feel like having a strong, quote unquote, professional process is one of the things that will help you the most with this entire issue. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that in the first instance, you have to actually demonstrate that you can actually achieve that higher level of polish, right? Which, again, isn't me telling you how to do that. I'm just saying, which maybe should be obvious, that that's kind of a big part of what we're aiming for, is to actually demonstrate in our portfolio a couple of times that we can actually reach that level of quality. The second thing is that, again, and what we're doing here is we're really pre-building that relationship with someone who might employ us, and trying to get a good understanding of, like, what are they after, and how can we communicate to them before we build a relationship that we might be someone who is worth pursuing. So, again, demonstrate the finished result a couple of times, right? Which proves, again, reliability, and that they have a good understanding of the product they're going to receive. The next thing would be not just demonstrate the finished result, demonstrate that you're going to be helpful to work with. And I think the primary way we do that is we just sort of demonstrate the process, right? We demonstrate that, and this I would say is not the best example, right? This is, again, probably in the middle of my sort of trying to figure some of these things out, but a big part of what I think will help you is if you are working on developing a strong, reliable process, which I've sort of talked about a little bit, but I'll go into mostly in this section. What that will sort of involve is often, again, having a very solid thumbnail, and again, having these sort of separated sort of steps that you can work with. And I think a big part of starting to build that relationship is when you present your work, you present it with these steps, and with the understanding that you're verbalizing, via your description or wherever, that this project was created, to a brief. It had challenges that were part of it, and, you talk about how you overcame those challenges, and, you basically explain to them that you are someone who understands how this process works, that it's not just one person sort of, creating an image, right? And I sort of talked about how I would sort of run into some of those issues where, the first few times I sort of had good opportunities, I feel like I wasn't presenting them with a very reliable process, right? and that sort of made it hard for them again to build a good relationship with me, right? It's basically me not helping myself out. So I think doing that will really help, right? So again, just talking about the brief, talking about each stage, and understanding that what you're normally doing when you're working at that high professional level is you're giving people thumbnails, you're taking feedback from those people you're working with, you're modifying the thumbnail, etc., right? Really simple stuff, but again, just understand that that's a big part of it, and how you present that will help you a lot. Now, none of that really tells you how to get the high level of quality, which is kind of what we're talking about. And again, I sort of have explained a little bit when I talk about my journey, again, sort of how that was a struggle. And it's not just a struggle from the sort of sense of okay, can I produce the work? But there's also the process that we use to get from, again, the idea to the end result. And I found, again, the first few times I got sort of jobs that I feel like could have been a really good opportunity, I didn't do a terrible job at it, but I certainly was not putting my best foot forward when it came to, again, being a good person to work with, right? And getting that kind of step-by-step thing happening, right? That really is where we gain competence. So I feel like there's the internal and the external aspect of that, right? And apologies, that might be a bit esoteric, but that's kind of how I think, right? And I'll start with the external, right? So I think what we're trying to do when we build a professional process, and if we look at sort of what that looks like, this is my sort of explanation of that, where, again, we work towards gaining that high level of polish through developing a strong ideation phase, a strong sort of black and white rough phase, and then again we build our sort of secondary forms and tertiary forms in a construction phase. We separate that from the the surface of the painting that people are going to see, right? Those clean lines, we focus on that at a separate time. And again, we make sure that we have things on layers, and that way we can easily edit things and apply art direction and feedback to the image, adjust colors, make things lighter, make things darker. Again, developing this sort of, I would call it like a robust sort of process. You might you could also call it like a professional process, but it's one that's sort of reliable. It has lots of steps along the way. The disadvantage is that you're often repeating steps, right? And you're spending a little bit more time in the middle. So that's sort of what I'm talking about, and I think this sort of process and developing this will help you a lot when it comes to attaining that goal. And from an external standpoint, what that really means is that we need to make sure we're practicing creating thumbnails, and we're practicing taking those through to the final and making sure that there's a strong relationship to them. Because again, from an external standpoint, one of the things that will help you, again, build those relationships is again, that reliability, right? And demonstrating that reliability. And then once you sort of, start getting that work, you can then, again, hopefully use that work, if it's not under non-disclosure, to kind of demonstrate, again, not only can you sort of do the work in the abstract, but, you have actually done it with an actual client, right? And the more you do that, then I feel like the more reliable you appear to people, right? So it's really a matter of sort of getting to that point. But I think, again, the best way to sort of build that is to start working on your process and developing these practices sort of now, so that you're kind of ready for it. And, that means, again, when you get that job, you'll probably be able to put your best foot forward, and you're better able to demonstrate that, right? And when you're sort of doing your sort of folio, to trying to get the work. And again, I think those are two sides of the coin, because, as I said, I often would get jobs that I feel like would be a good opportunity, and because I didn't do the best job at it, maybe they would have hired me a lot more after that, right? But, in some cases they did, and in some cases they didn't. So, again, that's where you can try and leverage that idea of, again, it's who you know, because you're building those relationships. And this is part of it, demonstrating that and building towards that. And again, building up that strength so that you can operate under pressure a little bit more, and have a more reliable process. And that's basically the idea, right? The thumbnail from an external point should match the finished result. I also think it's really important to have and practice the idea of having clear stages, right? So we need clear stages, so that we can, in our mind, separate them a little bit more and make sure we're sort of completing the cycle of each of those stages. Because in many cases, people are going to request, especially at those higher level sort of professional levels, they're going to request things like, the black and white rough. They might want to see, again, the construction drawing. What I sometimes will often do is kind of, just to sort of demonstrate where the image is going. If it's a very complicated image, I might even sort of, add some sort of tone, spend an hour or even a few hours sort of adding some tone to the rough construction drawing to just kind of say, this is kind of what I'm thinking. This is how, again, I'm sort of raising up that thumbnail, right? So having that ability to, again, work with others and having these clear stages in between your steps is really useful, because from an external standpoint, right, it allows people to give feedback. So it's not just sort of stopping wherever you would normally stop. It's stopping and collecting your thoughts visually so that you can present them to who you're working with and allow them to easily see what you're doing and easily give you feedback, right? That's the key. The easier that is, the better relationship you build. And I think, again, practicing this way will also help you practice to get the finished results, right? So it's the same thing. The more you kind of overlap those steps, I feel like the more that's going to allow you with your practice images, right, and your sort of folio images to get to that level. They're kind of the same thing. So, the next thing there in the external sort of bucket here is that this needs to be reliable, right? So a big part of, again, and I feel like this is useful not just for when you are working professionally, but also when you're working on these larger images that are maybe going to take you like weeks and weeks, if you're just sort of chipping away at them part-time to sort of develop your folio, you're going to need to understand how long that's going to take. But also from a professional standpoint, that also helps because you really need to know how long this is going to take you, what your schedule is going to be like, and how long it's going to take you to hit a particular quality goal. That's really important because, again, you can really upset your chances of getting rehired or even sort of hired if you sort of, essentially sort of overpromise and underdeliver on the quality. And again, that might not be your fault from an effort standpoint. It might just be your fault from an estimation, right, and a scheduling standpoint, right? You just sort of don't actually schedule enough time or tell someone how long you need to do it. And I feel like often if we do tell people that we're working with how long we need, frequently they can accommodate that, right? But again, not, within a reasonable range, right? So the main takeaway here is from an external standpoint is practice your process, right, with all of these steps so you can reliably hit those quality goals, right? And I think if you can reliably hit the same quality goals and present it to people, I think that will sort of really help you with again, building good relationships. And again, showing that you have the experience with the steps. And just don't wait until you actually get the job to kind of figure out how to do this, right? You want to be practicing that way. And I really do think that, similar to what I was saying, I feel like practicing this and having this overlapping sort of set of process steps, right, where, again, we sort of do a little bit more than maybe we need at the rough stage, right? And then we're kind of constructing, but we've kind of already constructed some stuff. And then maybe we construct quite a bit, so that there's really not a lot of guessing at the line stage. Developing that will, again, allow you to practice getting that high level of quality in a reliable way. And I think that needs to be reliable for you, because if you're going to invest that much time into it, into developing your folio and doing this, you kind of need to have the right mindset while you're doing it. And you need to sort of trust yourself that this is going to be worth it. It's worthwhile spending this huge amount of time to, develop these folio pieces, And I think having that process and understanding the time it takes and building up and working that way from the very start, I think is a really good way to do that, right? It makes you more relaxed. And again, that brings me to the internal side of it, which I think is, again, it's sort of the flip side of the external way that you would be viewed as professional. So the external, as we said, is the thumbnail should look like the final result. You should have clear stages to allow for feedback. And again, you should be reliable, right? When you say you're going to be able to do something, you should be able to do it. The internal side of that is pretty much the same, right? I think the more you're able to do that, the more you're able to sort of keep practicing in a way that your thumbnail will match your sort of finished result, the more relaxed you're going to be, okay, with the process, the more confident you're going to be when you're dealing with people. And I think that's good for you, and it's good for those you work with, right? Secondly, again, I feel like the more you kind of finish off each stage and develop that sort of strong, reliable, overlapping process, the more you're able to really put your best foot forward when you are asking for those feedback sessions and say, hey, like here is the best I can sort of do, at this rough stage. This is sort of, me really trying to tell you how it's going to look. And that gives you confidence to know, like, they're actually looking at something that is kind of representative of that stage. It's a lot easier to take on feedback that way. I would feel one of the bigger problems is I would kind of stop because, if I sort of look at my sort of work, we take that, look at my old work. One of the things that I would frequently do when I was sort of, working earlier on is I would kind of just assume people knew where I was going, and I would sort of send them a thumbnail or something, and then they would sort of give me feedback saying, hey, change this, change this, change this. And I'd be like, well, of course I'm going to change those things, right? I haven't got to that stage, but because I'm not communicating that to them, and because I didn't have like a strong process that I was able to show them, they don't know when I'm going to handle particular issues. And because maybe stuff was a little bit sketchier, they're going to sort of panic right at that thumbnail stage and kind of say, oh, just make sure you do all this stuff. So I think it's important, again, to understand that part of what we're doing is allowing you to collect the right feedback from people. And the more you're in control of this, the more you're sort of controlling the type of feedback you get. And I think the more you put your best foot forward, the more relaxed they're going to be, the more they're going to trust you, the better the experience is going to be. So again, this allows you to take on and ask for feedback, which I think helps you internally, right? It helps you manage that feedback as opposed to potentially, again, getting things that aren't actually what you need, right? Because you're like, well, of course I'm going to do that. This is just a sketch. So it's a little bit different, right? It's not just the process that, you need to get there. It's extra steps that you're using so that you can include others in the process, right? And the better you're able to manage that, the better relationships you're going to build, basically. And I think the last thing there, and really the most important thing of all of this, is that if you really do get control of this by developing a solid process, I think that really allows you to be more relaxed, again, focus on getting the right feedback, and that really lets you to relax a bit and actually focus on putting quality and good emotions into the work. And I think that's really what makes the difference, right? It's working under pressure and developing a process that will allow you to, again, develop the folio pieces, but also follow that up with actually doing that under pressure when you're working with someone. That means that the work that people actually see from you that is in these high-level products will be of the highest quality that you can create. And I think that's where you're going to see the most sort of success overall, right? You're going to get more and more of those, because keep in mind, this is a process, right? You're stepping up that ladder, getting better and better jobs that are closer and closer to the types that you're really aspiring to. And in order often to get those very high level jobs, you're going to need to do really, really good work on, stuff that maybe is in the middle, right? And again, all I'm talking about is just sort of probably like it's really just talking about sort of budget and prestige of that particular project or job that you're sort of working on. I don't necessarily think any of them are better or worse than the others. It's just, again, that often people who are employing people for those higher level jobs, sometimes they don't even pay that much more. It's just that it sort of has more prestige for the artist, or that's just kind of the project. That's just sort of the thing they always wanted to work on, right? But often everyone wants to work on that as well. So there's lots of competition, right? And again, it doesn't really mean why. It doesn't really matter why you want to do this. It just matters like, how do we do this, right? So again, that I'm not sort of trying to say a lot of those middle level projects are better or worse, right? That's just the best way of explaining it. But often you need to, again, demonstrate all of this stuff happening well before you get to your kind of, chosen ideal sort of highest level professional sort of job, right? So it's a process of perfecting this as you work with people, right? It's rare that it's going to just be like bang, happen first off. So again, it's a gradual journey, and those are the key sort of things that I think have really sort of helped me. Apologies, there's no sort of major, again, sort of magic bullet that will sort of, solve all of these problems. But that's really the best way I can sum up how important I think it is to develop a strong process, and how I think it fits into this idea of the professional work. And again, I think, I can't recommend working this way enough if you are aspiring to that, because I think it's the one thing that, again, will allow you to create high-level professional work and build your skills at the same time. And I think the sooner you start working on that, the better, right, from every aspect, right? The sooner you start working on that, the more used to working in that type of process you'll be. And that means, again, you're going to be able to get those jobs and do your best on them. And that will sort of help, again, when you demonstrate that you can do that, right? It's a gradual process, right? So anyway, those are the main things. I think understand the underlying sort of wisdom of, it's who you know. There's reasons for that, and I feel like if you were in the position that the art directors are in, you would do exactly the same thing, and you would understand why that sort of happens, right? And your job, again, is to be as approachable and reliable as you can, and to demonstrate that you are someone who's good to know before you actually do know someone. The second thing is think about developing the professional exterior, the external result of this, which is that, your thumbnails should look like the finished result, or your finished result should look like your thumbnails. And again, a huge part of why we do all this kind of thumbnailing and process stuff is because we're actually having to involve others in the process. And also that, lastly, the internal side of it is really a matter of making you relaxed and, able to take on feedback so that you can work under pressure and still put positive emotions into the work, right? Because again, I think that's what the people who are actually going to view it are going to care about, right? They're going to care about, is this really cool? Are you putting your personality into it and your sort of emotions into it, right? The more you can do that and get into a point where you're doing professional work and meeting the brief and putting a lot of like positive energy and emotional sort of content into the work, that's when, again, it'll be you'll be pushing it, downhill as opposed to uphill. So yeah, again, those are just my thoughts, and that's why I advocate such, again, an elaborate sort of process where we're doing all these kind of steps. That's why I think it's important, and that's why I do it. I feel like it's helped me a lot in all of those areas. Hopefully it can help you as well. The main takeaway is just start doing this. You know what I mean? No matter what you're doing, it doesn't have to be something where you're aspiring, and you're trying to do a crazy detailed image. Just try practicing some of these things, even in your sort of sketches or your sort of 1 hour images. Just try and sort of get used to working from the thumbnail, solving some of the problems that come up when you do that, and just continually working that way, right? It doesn't mean at all that you will, you're not going to lose the ability to just wing it and do sketches, right? The vast majority of my personal work is where I'm just kind of, sketching and doodling and doing that sort of stuff. But, when I have to do the professional work, this is the stuff that makes me more relaxed and happier, right? And then that actually, again, in at the end of the day is the most important thing for me, at least. Anyway, hopefully that's been helpful. Good luck with this. Good luck developing a solid process. I really recommend it, and good luck with your illustrations.